Its programs and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Studio B. We're here every Saturday noon Mountain Time, wherever you're tuning in from, whether it be morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome to the show. My lovely co-host, Leah Shaper, is joining us today.
Hello.
And today we are going to be discussing a very significant event in Earth's history, the most recent cosmic catastrophe, potentially. It's negotiable. But what we're talking about is the worst year to be alive on Earth, 536 AD.
It's a very interesting topic. Am I echoing? Do you hear that?
Nope.
Okay,
All good.
I was just going to say it's a really interesting topic because this has been a bit of a puzzle over the years. Scientists have been trying to figure out what exactly happened in 536 and what the causes are for quite a while, and not until starting around 2008 or 2004 did we really start to see what some of the factors were. And I think most of it is untangled now, it seems like to me.
Yeah, a lot of the speculation began in the early 80s, late 70s, because there are it's recent. 536 AD is just 1500 years ago. And there are piles and piles of historical accounts from all across the world that they were kind of cataloging, and they were coming to the conclusion that this time period was very bad. There are all kinds of annals in Scandinavia of things crashing, things in Europe crashing. But it wasn't until the last few decades that good scientific analysis on ice cores and proxy data actually started to bring together some of the ideas. What they did know, based on historical accounts as early as 50 years ago, was that potentially around 536 AD, the Earth went dark. There were accounts of up to a year and a half without visibly seeing the sun or the moon. There were just apparitions in the sky, so to speak, which means that the conclusion at that time in the early 80s was that there was some sort of a dust veil covering Earth.
Can I read some quotes here about what was going on? Because they're pretty interesting.
Please do.
Cassiodorus, who was a Roman statesman in 538, wrote, "The sun's rays were weak, and they appeared a bluish color. At noon, no shadows from people were visible on the ground. The heat from the sun was feeble. The moon, even when full, was empty of splendor. A winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. Prolonged frost and unseasonable drought. The seasons seem to be all jumbled up together." It's like, what a crazy time.
Yeah, it sounds like something was happening. Now, just on speculation, before we jump into the science, you can have a number of things. We could have been hit potentially by a meteor, or a comet could have hit somewhere and sent a bunch of dust up. A large meteor or comet could have hit an ocean where no one witnessed it and sent up millions of cubic miles of ocean into the atmosphere and above. That would block out the sun. Also cause torrential rainfall, though, for a continuous period of time, as well as tsunamis. So we would have accounts of that.
Yeah.
So
yeah. In fact, one of my favorite scientific papers on this subject, which is fairly recent from 2014, basically is suggesting that maybe all of those things happened: volcano, a cosmic impact, and an impact that hit the ocean, which would cause tsunamis and throwing up lots of moisture into the atmosphere and dropping it somewhere else. So that's pretty interesting. And there's evidence of all of those things.
To be clear, this didn't just happen on Thursday, August 8th, 536, right? So what we're going to reveal to you over the period of the next hour is the way that the science moved through the data, what the conclusions were in the past, what they are now, and implications for the future of humanity, which is bleak. Basically, if you've been watching the show for the last several months, At some point and some time, very near in the future, bad things are going to happen because it's been a very long time since the last bad thing happened. Now, we've seen like glimmers of potentially catastrophic things about to occur, which weren't catastrophic. Like last week was the 10-year anniversary of the Chelyabinsk comet outburst. It exploded above the earth, just like Tunguska didn't hit the earth. It injured tens of thousands of people, I think, but no one died because of it. It blew up in a remote area at the right place. Had Chelyabinsk come into Manhattan and blown up, there would have been millions injured and tens of thousands of deaths, if not buildings collapsing from the shockwave, glass exploding in, because that's what happened in Russia. The windows broke. And anyone near the window got glass all in their body. Yeah. In New York, it would have been millions of people injured.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and just to clarify for our listeners, Chelyabinsk is not it's not like a comet that like blew up right near Earth. This is like a piece of a comet, right? Like a meteor.
The Chelyabinsk is a they called it a cometary airburst because it was a charged meteor. So as it's coming in, it has a tail, and it's also a bolide. It's burning. It may have an ion tail, an extra tail, but because of the charge, it blew up 8 kilometers above the surface like an EMP or a nuclear bomb.
Right. So it's a piece of a comet that just hasn't discharged yet.
Or it might have been the remnants of the giant comet. They eventually become little pieces of pee and then become nothing.
Right.
So it was definitely a charged object. You can call it a comet or asteroid. It's negotiable. It certainly wasn't a dirty snowball. No comets are dirty snowballs. We've landed on them. They're dry rocks. I can assure you, please go look into the literature.
Yeah, and so just to distinguish between those things, right? Like an asteroid or a meteor is like a piece of rock. A comet is also a piece of rock, but the difference is that a comet is charged.
And typically...
And it's not a dirty snowball.
Yeah, it's charged in a way that it is discharging.
Yes.
Yeah, so it has to have a tail and an ion tail, typically perpendicular from the sun, because the solar wind is creating one of the two tails. The magnetic field's creating the other tail, and so they can shift around. And we just saw a comet, a 50,000-year comet, come around the sun, YTX, I believe, or something like that, an acronym like that, where the tail went from one side and then grew another tail out the other side at the same time. It was bizarre. And then it started to move in angles, and then it joined the double tail in the back. That is an electric comet based on Electric Universe and Thunderbolt's theory.
I was going to say, go watch Thunderbolt's project if you want to know more about why comets are not dirty snowballs and are these electrically charged objects that are discharging.
Yeah, they have a great documentary on the electric comet, so I would recommend that.
Yeah.
All right. Any other caveats before we dive into the information?
Nope.
All right, we're going to go over and share the screen. 536 AD, we're talking about, here is an article from The Conversation. It's pretty recent. And it says in the title, Volcanoes, Plagues, Famine, and an Endless Winter. Welcome to 536. What historians and scientists believe was the worst year to be alive. Pretty amazing. But there have been worse years, and they're similar, like 1347. Now, this is, a lot of people think that when you and I have called this period around 200 to around 700 as the Dark Ages. But many people refer to 1300 to 1600 or so as the Dark Ages.
Well, how about like 1108 to about like 1256? Now, I'm not familiar with what was going on during this time period, but I was looking at a graph yesterday of NSSS signals in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica. Can you tell me what NSSS is? Because I didn't find that. I believe it's a sulfate signal.
Yeah, some type of sulfur particulate or sulfate in parts per billion. So it's minuscule. Yeah. It's a proxy for a volcanic eruption at a distance. Right. And I have that. You can see the graph now from the Greenland.
Oh, yeah. So we've got a signal, signals starting at 1108 in both ice cores, both North and South Pole, right? All the way up to what the heck happened in 1258? I don't know. and what was going on before that. And this is a period that we call the Dark Ages as well. And this kind of suggests why.
Yeah, so there are two Dark Ages. One is during the medieval period, and that's the Dark Age that we're discussing, 1100 forward.
Right.
But the true Dark Age began shortly after the fall of Rome, as Rome was collapsing 200 or so AD, a sequence of events on Earth that lasted, amazingly, 1,000 years, included, it was kicked off at the very beginning here by a large volcanic eruption in 88 AD. And then we had 69 encounters with near-Earth comets for the next 300 years.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. So are these comets, when they come in close proximity to Earth, kicking off large volcanic eruptions, VEI 6 or greater? There is a very high probability that that could be it. Because
I'm starting to think that.
It's tweaking our magnetic field. A lot of times when we get alignments of planets, we'll get a large earthquake or something bizarre geophysically happening on Earth. But it's clear looking at this graph that from 0 to about 1300, there are lots of aerosols and particulates from volcanoes that are erupting on both sides of the Earth. You can see 434, 432. During that time period, there were volcanoes erupting in the northern and the southern hemisphere, but the biggest effect was in Antarctica, and we'll talk about that. That was Ilopanga that they thought may have caused this terrible year in 536. Well, it turns out that that erupted, in fact, much earlier.
Yeah, by the way, also, the Western Roman Empire actually collapsed at about 476. So somewhere in between Ilopango and whatever caused the terrible 18 months in 536.
Yeah, well, in the southern hemisphere, I bet it was even worse that was happening up in the northern hemisphere to collapse the Roman Empire. Yeah. And there's not a lot of accounts in the southern hemisphere. What's going on here?
Yeah, but there is evidence that says that the Ilopango volcano, destroyed an area of about 80 square kilometers.
Yeah, and killed everyone.
Right. Like everybody's gone after this thing erupts.
Yeah, so bad things are happening before we even get to 536 AD. Okay, and in this year, the sun dimmed and the world shivered. And we kicked off one of the two bubonic plague outbreaks that may have reduced the population on Earth significantly. Do you have any numbers?
On people?
Yeah.
Lost. I usually see figures that estimate about 50% of the population. I'm not really sure that we really know.
Yeah, for the 536 plague, I've seen estimates as high as 65% where local outbreaks occurred. So,
well, and then also there's the issue of untangling causes of death, right? Because you're going to have a lot of people that died of the plague, but then you'll probably also have people that died of starvation, right? Because you've got 18 months of a feeble sun. Growing food is going to be impossible. This is one of the things that is noted when in historical accounts, when people talk about this period, they'll say a failure of bread. So there's going to be a lot of different reasons why people are passing.
Right. And what we know from the last pandemic is that vitamin D deficiency plays a huge role in these types of outbreaks.
Good point. Good point.
So if it's been dark for a year and a half and then a plague occurs, the population that doesn't have access to good food and none of them have access to sunlight are going to suffer.
And also the bubonic plague is sensitive to temperature. So it tends to activate when it's colder. There's a threshold. I think it's like 25 C. And it's carried by fleas. It's a bacteria that's carried by fleas. And below that temperature, normally the flea would just pass the bacteria, but below that temperature, they don't pass it. It causes some clotting in their systems. They get overwhelmed by the bacteria. They pass it on to other animals like rodents and human beings, and now you have a plague.
Yeah, and I'm sure this has been happening. It didn't just start happening in 536 and then reemerge in 1300 or anything like that, the plague. It's probably, based on some information, been around for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, affecting hominids.
Absolutely, because if you wiped out the bacteria, then the disease would be gone forever, and we'd have some different bacteria that crops up. So it's always around. It's just a question of how much it impacts the organisms.
Yeah. Now, the big question is, how do you make it dark for a year and a half? It's not an easy task in a hemisphere. We just had the largest known explosion. It actually exploded into space just about, Hunga Tonga. And the longer they studied it, it took a year for them to actually figure out how high this went. It was the highest eruption ever recorded in a very long time. And it didn't even dim the sky. I mean, we had fantastic sunsets in Australia for months, and it's still happening. We have purple sunsets worldwide, but the sun is very crystal clear, even the day after Hunga Tonga. All the people there could see the sun. So what in the world could darken the skies for 18 months?
Yeah, and I was thinking last night, I was reading about Ilopango, otherwise known as Tierra Bloven. What is it? Tierra Bloven. I forget, but it means young white earth, which is kind of interesting. But comparing it to that, I mean, that volcano clearly caused a lot of destruction, but it still was fairly localized, even with these large volcanic signals in the ice core record. There's no indication that this spread around the globe like whatever happened in 536 did. So 536 is big. We've got something huge going on.
Yeah, and then 626 has a relatively large spike in the northern hemisphere. Now, if we're looking at these spikes, these are spikes in NSSS in parts per billion, which is a precursor sulfate for volcanic eruption. The 434 spike in the southern hemisphere in Antarctica, that's Ilopango. That is estimated to just be VEI 6.
Yeah.
Now, granted, it's very high VEI 6, approaching 7. I think they said
I think it's 6.9.
Yeah, VEI 6.9, if there's such a thing. So it's a big eruption, similar to Tambora, but Tambora didn't block the sun out for a year and a half. It gave us the year without a summer, but there are no accounts of it being dark for a year and a half.
I also read that it probably exceeded the magnitude of Pinatubo as well.
Or
the effects did anyway.
Ilopango?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Pinatubo was minuscule. I think 1.4 C or less.
Right.
Over a period of a year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these events are much bigger, and I think something else is going on, to be quite honest. And the reason is just because if you use Occam's razor and you look into the literature, early on in 2004, a paper came out, said a comet impact at 536 ? Because we don't have any examples of volcanoes darkening the skies for months or years. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, critically thinking, you would need a dozen volcanoes strategically placed, erupting for weeks high above the atmosphere in order to accomplish this. And there's not evidence for that.
Yeah. Oh, question for you. I did read that there's one paper that really does some excellent analysis of the Ilopango eruption. And that analysis concludes that the plume was about 45 kilometers. How high into the atmosphere is that?
Ilopango is in the Philippines.
No, El Salvador.
Okay, so in El Salvador, you're close to the equator.
Yeah.
And that brings the top of the atmosphere up to around 55,000 feet. So it was only erupting in the atmosphere, which would not darken the skies at all.
Yeah, so that's part of the equation, is the height of the eruption is critical to its effects.
You need to penetrate through the atmosphere into the upper levels where it can retain the dust and the sulfates and the deposits for years.
Yeah.
See, once you penetrate the atmosphere, it takes 1 to 3 years to get back down, fall back down. That way, for that reason alone, the whole idea of solar geoengineering, which is stratospheric aerosol injection. So they go above the atmosphere into the stratosphere, which is what holds the particles. They dump the particles up there and it blocks the sun for years because they don't re-enter.
Right.
The whole idea that people are getting sick on the surface from chemtrails is completely idiotic.
Yeah.
When people are looking up at these chemtrails, they think they're going to fall on them. They're actually going to move past them hundreds of miles and never hit the ground.
Right.
They're clouds.
Right.
Clouds very infrequently hit the ground.
Oh dear, we could spend a whole episode talking about debunking chemtrails. Although we've done that in the past. We could do it again, but not right now.
Yeah. But what we want to what I think we're trying to prove here is that volcanic eruptions cannot explain a darkening of the skies in 536 for 18 months.
Yeah. Yep. Not alone, not by itself. Anyway,
No.
It may have been a contributing factor, but it couldn't have done it alone.
Before we get into some speculation in the second half, we got about 7 minutes here till the break, we'll go over the timeline on what the science has revealed up till now. And this is after Ilipanga. So Ilipanga has already occurred, right?
Yeah.
434.
431 plus or minus 2 is the estimate. So there's a delay in that signal by like a year or two.
Yeah, because it's El Salvador is nowhere near Antarctica, so the deposits have to spin around the southern hemisphere and slowly spread out before they can start falling on the ice.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to jump forward about 100 years after this first devastating thing occurred, and now we're in 536 when everyone's about to die. According to the ice cores, when you look at the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, the main signal is coming from the northern hemisphere, and it got really bad in Scandinavia. So the assumption is that something up in the higher latitude erupted that would have immediately affected Scandinavia in a big way. And where are all the big volcanoes up near Scandinavia? Iceland. Mm-hmm. Iceland is just to the west. The prevailing wind takes all of the debris over to Scandinavia, and so they suggest that there was a large volcanic eruption in Iceland in 536.
Which is supported by that there was volcanic glass found in the ice core that matched the chemical signatures in Europe.
You are brilliant. I'm because I was just about to bring up that point, and it's excellent. That is the nail in the coffin's back that makes it an Icelandic volcano. There's actually volcanic glass that matches the petrography of Iceland. So yeah. That means it didn't come from Europe or South America. It means it came from Iceland.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty simple fact. Now, here's the unique thing about Iceland, that it is actually an island over top of the mid-ocean ridge. So these volcanoes are connecting deep in the mantle. They may extend all the way down to the outer core. And so there are examples of volcanoes erupting in Iceland for years. And so some of these volcanoes can erupt for years at VEI 5 or even VEI 6. Mm-hmm. And the amount of soot and ash that would be pumped into the atmosphere if it continuously erupted for years would darken the skies. So
that's a really good point. I didn't really consider that fact.
Yeah, Iceland is one of the only places with these types of volcanoes that can erupt for long periods of time.
Yeah.
Another good example was a miniature example is La Palma. You know, that erupted for months. And that's like a local version of this bigger event. It like darkened the skies on the island of La Palma for the entire time it was erupting. They could barely see the sun. So it's almost like a smaller version of what actually happened, and we just watched it in a smaller scale.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's good. That's a good model for thinking.
And I like the Icelandic volcanic eruption lasting for years continuously, because it would in particularly certain places that are directly downwind would be the worst affected. Northern Europe, Scandinavia. I mean, yeah, it would have been bad in Asia.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we have lots of accounts in Europe as well as in Asia of how bad things were.
Do you have any available?
Yeah, let's see. This is a cool one. This is from the Byzantine historian Procopius. So Byzantine is the Eastern Roman Empire that was still existing at this time. In 536, he wrote, "And it came about during this year that a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were neither free from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death." So, I mean, that's interesting because it's not just the lack of sun and the colder temperatures. It's that those climatic changes bring about societal conflict, wars and such. I was reading about how the Byzantine Empire ended up fighting with the Sasanians, which was the last pre-Islamic Iranian empire. And they sort of had a peace for a little while, and then it was quickly done with. There's the
break. Now, guys, when we come back, this is the kickoff of the coldest decade in thousands of years, and it's bad. We'll be right back.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. There was blood on the wire. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
There have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
I'm aware of some archaeologists that have uncovered large bones indicating giants in Virginia. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down and
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford. Join me every Thursday night in Studio A at 6 p.m. Eastern for Factor Theory Live. Find us on www.revolution.radio. Great guests and great stories. What do you believe?
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Thank you for the applause, ladies and gentlemen. That was fantastic. And we're back with the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe, discussing the worst year on Earth.
Hey, Diamond, if you don't mind, I'd like to share a couple of other quick accounts, anecdotal evidence that I think are pretty interesting.
Yes, please.
So there's apparently in Finnish poetry, there's a storyline about a strong female sorcerer who took the sun as a prisoner and shut it inside a mountain, and then the sun didn't shine anymore. I thought that was cool. There are also Australian Aboriginal stories of fiery stars falling from the sky and striking Earth, causing death and destruction, which I find particularly interesting because, and this is total speculation at this point, but I'm starting to think that the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is northeastern Australia, which has two big craters in it, may be the impact site, maybe. Also, low temperatures and even snow reportedly fell in August in China, which of course caused crop failures and delays. There's talk of a dense, dry fog in the Middle East and in China and in Europe. And there was also drought in Peru, which affected the moche culture. And some people think that this time period was the downfall of the moche culture.
Yeah, or the Mayans in general really were hard hit by this.
And the Nazca were around at that time as well.
Interesting.
So and apparently they were still around at 700, so I don't know. But.
So there could be a volcano erupting in Iceland for continuously a long period of time, starting around this time, that could have been kicked off by an impact in the southern hemisphere that was witnessed by the Aboriginals.
Yeah,
so if a comet bangs into the ocean and creates a tsunami, or let's say it's the Gulf of Carpentaria. We know about the tsunami there. We did a show on it. It washed up. There's huge echelon dunes way inland there.
Yeah.
And so everyone would have been killed there, and there would be no witnesses to the impact. But no one in the northern hemisphere would know that happened. Something could have hit, boom, shook the earth and caused the mid-ocean ridge in Iceland to start erupting. So it's like a simultaneous cause and effect.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting is in one paper, this is a paper written by Dallas Abbott in 2014, he talks about that in the GISP 2 ice cores, that the cosmic dust is highest in 533 and it declines until 536. And then there's a new injection of dust in 536, and that declines till like 537. And then there's a third injection at 538, which declines until 539 and 540. So we've got multiple signals going on here. I mean, to me, that indicates clearly that there's multiple events happening.
And then there's a second volcanic eruption, 540 to 541 on this paper.
Yeah, that too.
Which drops the temperature even further, 1.4 to 2.7 C.
Yeah.
And then after the eruption, boom, the Justinian plague spreads through the Mediterranean, killing 35 to 55% of the population, speeding the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yeah.
There are also accounts in Scandinavia that was a huge smelting nation up there. They were making bronze jewelry. It ended 536, and it didn't start back for a very long time.
Yeah.
In fact, the ice cores after the Justinian plague show that there wasn't any smelting in the northern hemisphere for 100 years. And we pointed this out on Rex's show. That's 3 generations of humanity before they started making melting metals. That's insane.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a long period of time of people clearly focused on just surviving rather than, I'm going to call it like higher civilization activities, right? Like you're probably not going to see a lot of new like monumental buildings being built during this time period because it's just simply not important.
Yeah, and we have more and more spikes even in that time frame. During those 3 generations, there's this massive 626 spike.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very
So
curious about that.
And there's a 575 spike. So there's more massive eruptions happening. So the people are clawing back. The next generation gets a farm or whatever. Then boom, the weather is terrible. So it's literally 3 generations before it calms down. And then around 640, so that there's this lull here between 626 and this tiny eruption in 680. That's when they get it back together. And there's really no big eruptions until 1000 AD, 939 here.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, when you have one of those days, like you have a really bad day, something bad happens, and then the bad things just keep coming, except this is spread out over hundreds of years.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
You can see the screen share I'm doing?
No, actually.
Oh, well, that's because I'm not screen sharing.
Well, it might help if you did that.
Oh, let me see if I can figure this out. Yeah, where am I? Okay, there you go. I just forgot to push the button.
Push the button.
So this is also in myth and legend. You've heard of the Ragnarok legend?
Yes.
And where does that come from?
Iceland.
And so what do you have that anything pulled up from that?
You know, I did read something about that in relation to all of this, but I don't think I have it on hand.
Yeah, that sucks.
Bummer. Yeah, because that's like a story that potentially reflects the anecdotal evidence of what was going on here.
Yeah, so things really picked up pace about 14 years ago when they started to look into the ice cores, and then they started to look into the tree rings.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the tree ring data was really nailed the coffin on the head that this was a long-term global event because the tree rings almost everywhere record it.
Yeah. Michael Bailey, who's from the Queen's University of Belfast, he's a dendrochronology expert. So I believe he's kind of the guy that really spurred all of that on. And he confirms like 540 AD as having a big signal. He says it's the second, well, he points out that it's the second largest ammonium signal in the Greenland ice, but it also matches the dendrochronology evidence.
What was
so
the
that's
year?
Very, 540.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so there is a spike in the Antarctic core only on the 540.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although I think that the signals at 536 and 540 might be the same signal.
Yeah, there's definitely a plus or minus on these ice core.
Well, right, but
as far
but
as
also,
dating.
Sure. But then also it may have taken, you know, and then there's a delay here with NSSS, and then there may be a delay getting to the other hemisphere as well.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So the Justinian plague kicks off not in the beginning. It takes 5 years of it to be dark and crop failures, and then a second eruption, and then we've got the bubonic plague. Now, what's curious to me is that plagues are often associated with comets.
Mm-hmm.
So when people lose their heads because comets are very bright and very close, not far away, we haven't seen a bright, close comet in all of modern history. If we were to, people would lose their minds. They'd jump off buildings. You know, it would be the second coming of Christ or whatever.
What about Halley's Comet in 1986?
Not that you saw. Did you see it?
I did. I was 9, so I don't remember it that well, but
it's not like
not super bright.
Yeah, of the historical comets that freak people out.
Right. It was just cool, but it's not like something where you go, oh my God.
If you were to come out of your house and look up and fear for your life.
Right.
It's so big, it looks like it's coming to hit you.
Yeah.
Obviously, probably not.
But speaking of Halley's Comet, this is important. Halley's Comet did pass by Earth in 530, and this is well documented by the Chinese. Specifically, they saw it between August 29th of 530 and September 27th. And that was, it was at its brightest at 530. The next time it was that bright was 1222. So on Rex's show, I was talking about the possibility that, okay, we had a flyby of Halley's Comet, and maybe there's some debris from Halley's Comet that's trailing behind it. And perhaps that's the cosmic impact that is responsible for this dark period, or partially.
I don't think it could be 6 years behind it.
Yeah, I'm questioning that part. Right.
Because in his historical accounts, when bad things happen from comets, you need to come into close proximity to the tail. So the comet may seem it's out in space, and as it passes by, headed towards and around the sun, let's say, at some point, the Earth could then rotate in its orbit literally into the back path of the tail, which is dragging all the debris. So then you would go into a debris field and you would have numerous objects coming in and hitting the Earth.
Well, that's kind of what I meant too. And I want to throw out there too that there's some wiggle room in all of this dating, right? Like I was just reading about how one scientist was doing what he was calling wiggle matching to kind of map dendrochronology signals onto radiocarbon 14 signals, and that's sort of helping to make the dating more precise. So like when we're talking about very specific dates, keep in mind that there's a margin of error there that may not have been fully worked out.
Well, especially in historic accounts coming from China, the dating of those historic accounts is based on the dating from them. We've changed the calendar since then many times.
Right.
So 530 Halley Comet flyby might be 536 AD in our new modern time.
Sure.
Yeah.
But we do know the periodicity of
enough.
Halley's Comet pretty well, don't we?
Yeah, but we really don't know when 536 AD was because they've changed the calendars.
Right. Our 530 may not be China's 530, in other words.
They may have done it for a reason.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
There are lots of YouTube channels out there, and we even have books from Missing Time where in the past they have removed whole swaths of time potentially.
Right.
Some people suggest that the year 2023 is actually just 11 or 1023.
Right. But that's a whole other conversation.
So to be close within a few years, going back this far, it could have a cause and effect. And like I said, there are lots of literature out there that show that plagues may come from extraterrestrial sources.
Right.
So,
I mean, there is a biological explanation for why the Justinian plague may have occurred when it did. I mean, that may not be correct, or maybe there's more than one thing going on here. Not to mention the fact that the Justinian plague is caused by a bacteria, which I highly doubt would survive in space. A virus.
No, it's not a virus. Yeah. So that viruses typically come from space is what the claim is.
Yeah.
But there could be other things going on here. There is very limited information on grand solar minimas at this time.
Yeah.
So there was a grand minima 700 years prior to this, and then the next grand minima, the Oort or something, doesn't occur until like 900 or 1100, and there's a whole span of like 1,000 years where they don't say anything about the sun. So the sun could be in a weak disposition during this time as well.
Yeah, I did kind of look at this, and the graph that I looked at did not have very good resolution, but it did look like 536 actually happened at a solar maximum, certainly not a grand solar maximum, but it's a solar maximum. It looks to me like in maybe not a grand solar minimum, but like a pretty weak set of cycles.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so what do you think happens around the world from after the bubonic plague? I mean, according to the accounts, how long until it dies out? It's just a few years, according to many accounts. It takes at least 2 years to spread.
Oh, you know what? I don't actually remember, but I thought it was longer than that.
And I'm just looking at the date. Yeah, the date on the graph.
And that there were multiple pulses of the plague as well. And so I'm guessing that is probably because after 536, right, we do enter the Little Ice Age, right? Like overall, the climate gets kind of wacky in this period. So if we're hitting a lot of cold periods, that could bring on the plague again.
Yeah, because let's repeat that. The plague is brought on by cold temperatures.
Yeah, because it's specifically how the flea is processing that bacteria that is allowing the plague to spread or not.
Yeah, so the To be clear, the mini ice age did not begin until the end of the medieval maximum. And that the warmest period in the last 1,000 years was the medieval maximum, 1100 to 1250. So shortly after 1250, we go into the Wolf minimum right after that, which is 1280 to 1350. And that is the beginning of the Little Ice Age.
Oh, okay. So maybe I have the wrong name. I thought there was an extensive cold period, like in the 600, 650 range, but I guess maybe I'm wrong.
That's what I'm suggesting, but it's not listed. So
I think I might have seen it somewhere.
Okay.
So we'll have to scoop that up again, but.
Yeah, because there's the Homeric minimum, 950 BC to 800 BC, and then the Ort minimum, 1040 to 1080. Those are the only two listed. And because of the length of time between them, there has to be other grand minimas because there's a 200, a 400, and a 1,000-year cycle.
Yeah.
And that's from the work of Valentina Zarkova.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about this in regards to our modern humanity. We've got about 12 minutes left here. What if a similar scenario like this occurs now? How does it unfold? Let's say that because we're due for a VEI 5 or greater eruption from Iceland. They always erupt and they will erupt again. About a decade ago, we had a VEI 5 there. It stopped air traffic. It made people a little nervous for a couple weeks. Remember that?
Yep,
it was darkening the skies a little.
It shut down air traffic a bit.
Yeah. But what if we kick that up a notch, like to VEI 7?
Yeah. I mean,
and at the same time, we're in a magnetic excursion, right? And a grand solar minimum is screwing with the weather. And then this volcano goes off.
And we may be due for a cosmic impact as well. I mean, we talked in a previous show about this concept of coherent catastrophism, where we periodically intersect the orbits of meteor streams, and that we should be in a period of coherent catastrophism right now. Like we should be in a period of having multiple objects impacting Earth. So that could be happening as well, all at the same time.
What evidence is that?
That is based on the periodicity, I think, of the Taurid meteor stream. That our orbit would be intersecting that orbit. It's like, 4 times every 6,000 years. So roughly every 1,500 years.
So we're entering back into the Taurid meteor stream as well, which Göbekli Tepe may be an astronomical observatory warning us about the Taurid meteor stream.
Now, it could be that the Taurid meteor stream, is less concentrated than it once was. So we may not see as many impacts. Actually, incidentally, there was just a meteor that touched down in Texas this past week. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that meteor was when it was one of the only seven objects seen before it hit the ground. It was measured at a width of 6.9 feet when they noticed it, and after it burned up, they just found it 2 days ago.
Oh, they did find it?
Yeah, it's about 4 inches.
And people said it shook the ground.
That was
and over a wide area, people reported that.
Just a 6-foot rock.
Yeah, and it caused like an earthquake. So, I mean, we talked about this before, right? That it's estimated that a cometary impact, let's say around 536, only needed to be about 600 meters wide. So it's not that big.
Meters or feet?
Meters.
Okay. That's still that's a 1/4 mile wide rock. That's a big rock.
Sure, but considering the level of destruction, when we compare the results of a VEI 6.9 to 7.3, like such as might have been at Ilopango, and that it did not seem to have a global impact that we know of, and the evidence looks like it probably did not. So when you compare the magnitude of destruction that these things can cause, it's kind of amazing to think that a rock that's a 1/4 mile wide could cause something so large.
Yeah, and if you do the seismic study on it, a rock that large hitting the Earth doesn't really cause that large of an earthquake. Maybe 8.5.
Really?
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So a 9 magnitude earthquake is literally like a 6 mile wide rock hitting Earth.
Oh my God. So
people
if it happened
wonder why
today,
earthquakes. Yeah. The
I
what?
mean, if it happened today, any of these things or all of them together, it's hard to even conceptualize. I mean, utter chaos, right? I mean, like,
Well, if anything were to darken the skies for a year, there would
yeah.
be the end of air travel because jet engines can't operate with stuff going through them. They burn up. So literally all flights would be grounded.
Yeah. Well, and then our ability to grow food obviously is going to be severely impacted. And it's worse today because we have all of this macro agriculture, monoculture, right? Where you can't pick up and move the whole operation to a slightly better location. Not to mention that may not even be an option here. If the skies are darkened globally, it may not matter that much where your agriculture is taking place. It makes it that much harder to adapt.
Well, and think how fragile the new generation is and just humanity in general.
Yeah. You know, and our electrical grid is super fragile. Psychologically, we're incredibly fragile. We've got all of these people staring into their little rectangles looking for answers, which would no longer be available.
No, even if the grid stays up, I don't think it matters. If the sky goes dark with the fragility of humanity, they're on the 50% are mentally ill. They're on the cusp of depression. Yeah. Without seeing the sun for months, the suicide rates would skyrocket. Everyone would be depressed. It would be a very depressing world.
And maybe one of the greatest threats, like, okay, let's take people like you and I, right? Like we're doing our best to be as prepared as we can with our homestead and growing our own food and having supplies and all of that kind of stuff. If we're now dealing with people who are off their rockers because they were already mentally ill to begin with, they're a huge threat.
Yeah. It's literally, any of these scenarios that we think of always brings you to the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, which I think we're already in my opinion.
Yeah, what the new generation, 22 and younger, is not only are they the smallest generation because no one's having babies, right, to save the environment, but the children that are coming out of the wombs are so fragile, so brainwashed.
And they're being taught that the rest of the world has to cater to their deficiencies, which is just awful. And
they don't want to work. They have no ethic. They're like, oh my God, at 40 hours a week, I have no life. I can't do that. Just like I work 80 hours a week for the first 20, once I turned 15.
Well, and the thing that those young people that that complain about working 40 hours don't understand is that human beings have been working for their survival forever. If you have to go hunt for your food, grow your food, you're working all the time. These people think that they should just be handed everything by the government from what money? Money that is generated by people who work. The only difference between ancient culture and now we work for money versus working directly for the food. That's the only difference. We've always been working.
Well, and the wake-up call here, can you imagine what the people in 536 AD did to survive? They didn't go to the supermarket and buy their groceries. They were all agrarian. They were growing their own food. They had sheep and animals and milk all right there in each house.
Yeah.
And if those things die, and then you can't hunt, gather or whatever, because they're also going into the woods, to get the berries in the spring and the fruit in the fall. Because if you didn't know, wild fruit trees grew in the forest before we came and destroyed the world. Right. Like North America was covered in quince, but we brought European diseases and we killed off all the natural fruit.
And also we practice monoculture, right? Which depletes a lot of nutrients from the soil and makes it much harder to grow things.
Destroys the biodiversity, and the biodiversity is key. Certain insects can only pollinate certain plants. If you kill the plant or the insect, you start to break down the biodiversity you need for a healthy earth. Yeah. We're just so far removed that if an event like this were to happen, and most people think that humans, at their core, are good, honest people, I don't think that there'll be a lot of useful idiots that will be useless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely.
So what came first? What comes first? All right, we've got a few minutes here. Let's break it down. For the people listening, they always ask me, well, what's the biggest threat? Like that we just had an X 2.28 come off the sun. It's going to be It's barreling towards us. The model shows it hitting the night of the 19th, early into the 20th. Okay. Based on the density, there is a 5% chance, in my opinion, that it could do something to some of the grids on Earth, potentially. Mm-hmm. There's a 10% chance there could be major communication issues, mm-hmm. and a 25% chance of issues in general, meaning exploding powerhouses or substations. Something will happen.
Yeah. We're already done. Hey, look, I know we're all doom and gloom all the time, but take the catastrophes and embrace them for your survival. You'll become a full human being if you do that.
Yeah, preparation is peace of mind. That's boom.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.